What happens when a routine political interview transforms into one of the most explosive exchanges in broadcast history? When Vice President Kamala Harris sat down with MSNBC's Eugene Daniels, nobody expected the conversation that was about to unfold. What started as standard questions about policy quickly escalated into something far more intense, revealing a side of the vice president that viewers had never seen before. The exchange became so heated that it left the entire studio in stunned silence, and what was said in those crucial moments has everyone talking. But before we get into exactly what went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think about political interviews getting this real. Now let's dive into what actually happened. The interview began in the MSNBC studio with Eugene Daniels, one of the network's most respected political correspondents, sitting across from Vice President Harris. The lighting was set, the cameras were rolling, and the atmosphere seemed professional and controlled. Daniels opened with what appeared to be a straightforward question about recent economic policies, the kind of question any seasoned politician could navigate with ease. "Madam Vice President, thank you for joining us today," Daniels began, his voice steady and professional. "I want to start by addressing something that's been on many Americans' minds. Your administration has repeatedly stated that the economy is strong, yet we're seeing polling data that suggests a majority of Americans don't feel that way. How do you reconcile those two realities?" Harris shifted slightly in her seat, a practiced smile on her face as she prepared to deliver what seemed like it would be a standard response. "Well, Eugene, I appreciate the question. What we're seeing is a disconnect between the data and the perception, and that's something we take very seriously. The unemployment numbers are strong, wages are rising, and we've created millions of jobs. But we also understand that many families are still struggling with costs, particularly when it comes to groceries and housing." Daniels nodded, but his follow-up came quickly. "With respect, Madam Vice President, that sounds like the same talking points we've been hearing for months. I'm asking you something different. Why should Americans believe those statistics when their lived experience tells them something else entirely? Are you suggesting that their reality is somehow wrong?" There was a slight pause. Harris's expression changed almost imperceptibly, a flash of something crossing her face before she responded. "I'm not suggesting anyone's reality is wrong, Eugene. What I'm saying is that economic recovery is complex, and it doesn't happen uniformly across every community at the same time. We're working every day to address the challenges that real families are facing." "But that's just it," Daniels pressed, leaning forward slightly. "You say you're working on it, but what specifically has changed in the last 6 months? Because from where many Americans are sitting, it feels like a lot of talk and not a lot of action. Can you point to one concrete thing that's different today than it was half a year ago that actually impacts the average family's bottom line?" The temperature in the room seemed to shift. Harris's jaw tightened just slightly, and her response came with a bit more edge than before. "Eugene, I think that's a bit unfair. We've implemented multiple programs, we've fought for legislation, we've pushed for corporate accountability on price gouging. The idea that nothing has changed simply isn't accurate, and frankly, that kind of framing doesn't serve your viewers who are looking for substantive information." Daniels didn't back down. "Madam Vice President, I'm not trying to be unfair. I'm asking the questions that our viewers want answered. And when you say you fought for legislation and pushed for accountability, can you name one piece of legislation that's actually passed and made a material difference? Because I think that's what people are asking for. Specifics, not general statements about fighting and pushing." "You know what, Eugene?" Harris's tone had changed now, becoming sharper. "I came here expecting a serious conversation about policy, not a gotcha interview designed to create viral moments. Yes, I can name legislation. The infrastructure bill alone has created jobs in every state. The CHIPS Act is bringing manufacturing back to America. These aren't abstract concepts. These are real programs affecting real people." "Those bills passed years ago," Daniels countered immediately. "I'm asking about recent action, recent changes, and I have to push back on the characterization that this is a gotcha interview. These are straightforward questions about your administration's record. If asking for specific recent accomplishments is considered a gotcha, Doesn't that itself say something about the substance of that record? The air in the studio had become noticeably tense. Harris sat up straighter, her voice rising slightly in volume. What it says, Eugene, is that you've come into this interview with a narrative already written in your mind. You're not actually listening to the answers I'm giving you. You're waiting for me to finish speaking so you can deliver your next prepared attack line. That's not journalism. That's performance. With all due respect, Madame Vice President, Daniels responded, his own voice firm, I'm doing exactly what a journalist is supposed to do. I'm asking tough questions and following up when the answers don't address what was actually asked. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps the issue isn't with the questions, but with the difficulty in defending the record. Harris's eyes flashed. You want to talk about being uncomfortable? Let's talk about the double standard at play here. I notice that when you interview certain political figures, the questions are softballs wrapped in sympathy. But when I sit in this chair, suddenly it's full prosecution mode. Why is that, Eugene? What makes me deserve a different level of scrutiny? Daniels looked genuinely taken aback for a moment, but he recovered quickly. That's a serious accusation, Madame Vice President. I ask tough questions of everyone who sits in that chair, regardless of party or position. But since you've raised it, are you suggesting that holding you accountable for your administration's record is somehow unfair treatment? I'm suggesting, Harris said, her voice controlled but intense, that there's a pattern in how certain people are questioned versus others. And if you can't see that pattern, then maybe you need to examine your own biases. I've given you specific answers about infrastructure, about manufacturing, about job creation. But instead of engaging with those facts, you keep moving the goalposts and demanding something different. The interview had clearly gone off script. Daniels glanced briefly at his notes, then back at Harris. Madame Vice President, the goalposts haven't moved. I asked a simple question about what has changed in the last 6 months that materially impacts American families. The bills you mentioned are from earlier in the administration. I'm still waiting for an answer to the actual question that was asked. Harris leaned forward now, her voice taking on a lecturing tone. And I'm still waiting for you to acknowledge that economic policy doesn't work on a 6-month news cycle, Eugene. Real change takes time. Real programs need time to implement and show results. But you want me to give you a sound bite that fits your narrative that nothing is happening, nothing is working. I won't do that because it's not true. So if I'm understanding correctly, Daniels said, his tone measured but firm, you're saying that asking for recent measurable results is somehow unfair because economic policy takes time. But Madame Vice President, you and the President campaigned on immediate relief. You promised actions that would provide rapid assistance to struggling families. So which is it? Were those campaign promises unrealistic, or has the administration simply not delivered on them? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harris's expression hardened, and when she spoke, there was no mistaking the frustration in her voice. You're twisting my words, Eugene, and you know it. We promised to fight for families, and that's exactly what we've done. But we're also dealing with a Congress that has obstructed meaningful progress at every turn. We're dealing with corporate interests that are more concerned with profit margins than with the well-being of everyday Americans. Those are realities that don't fit neatly into your simplistic framing. Madame Vice President, Daniels responded quickly, I haven't twisted anything. I'm quoting your own campaign rhetoric back to you. And as for Congress, your party controlled both chambers for the first 2 years. What was the obstacle then? Why weren't these immediate relief measures passed when you had the votes? Harris's voice rose noticeably. Because even within our own party, Eugene, we had members who refused to support the full scope of what we wanted to accomplish. We had people more concerned with their own political futures than with helping the American people. But instead of talking about those obstructionists, the media, your network included, spent all their time criticizing us for not doing enough. You can't have it both ways. I'm not trying to have it both ways, Daniels said, his voice remaining steady despite the increasing tension. I'm trying to understand where the accountability lies. You're the Vice President of the United States. You're second in command of this administration. When Americans are struggling and they look to Washington for answers, they're looking to you. So when you deflect to Congress, when you deflect to corporate interests. When you deflect to the media, it starts to sound like everything is everyone else's fault, and none of it is yours. That's not what I'm doing, Harris shot back, her hands gesturing emphatically. What I'm trying to get you to understand is that governing is complicated. It's not a fairy tale where you wave a magic wand and fix everything overnight. There are real structural obstacles, real opposition, real challenges that we're navigating every single day. And yes, I'm going to point those out when a journalist sits here and acts like those obstacles don't exist. Daniels nodded slowly. I understand that governing is complicated, Madame Vice President, but you're a skilled politician. You're a former prosecutor. You know how to navigate complex systems. So let me ask you directly, do you believe your administration has done everything it possibly could have done to help struggling Americans? Not what Congress allowed, not what corporate interests permitted, but everything within your power as Vice President and as part of this administration. There was a long pause. Harris stared at Daniels, and for a moment it seemed like she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, but no less intense. I believe we have worked harder than any administration in recent memory to address the needs of everyday people. Have we accomplished everything we set out to do? No. But that doesn't mean we haven't tried, and it doesn't mean we're not still fighting. That's not what I asked, Daniels pressed. I asked if you've done everything within your power, everything you personally could have done. Because there's a difference between trying and succeeding, and there's also a difference between facing obstacles and using those obstacles as excuses. Which category does your administration fall into? Harris's jaw clenched visibly. You know what, Eugene? This right here is exactly the problem with political coverage today. You're not interested in nuance. You're not interested in the reality of how government actually works. You want me to either say we've failed completely or claim we've succeeded perfectly, because those are the only two narratives that generate headlines. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but the truth is more complicated than that. I'm not asking you to choose between two extremes, Daniels countered. I'm asking you to take personal responsibility for your role in this administration. When voters go to the polls, they're going to be asking themselves whether their lives are better now than they were 4 years ago. And if the answer is no, they're going to hold you and the president accountable. So I'm giving you an opportunity right now to speak directly to those voters and tell them what you've personally accomplished. What have you done? The vice president's voice took on a sharp edge. What have I done? I've traveled to dozens of countries representing American interests abroad. I've worked on voting rights initiatives. I've championed maternal health programs. I've been a voice for criminal justice reform. I've met with labor leaders, business leaders, community organizers, and everyday Americans to understand their concerns and fight for solutions. That's what I've done, Eugene. And the fact that you're asking the question as if I've been sitting idle is insulting. With respect, Madame Vice President, Daniels said, his tone remaining professional but pointed. Traveling and meeting with people is part of the job description. I'm asking about results. Voting rights legislation hasn't passed. Maternal health outcomes for certain communities have actually gotten worse. Criminal justice reform has stalled. So again, what concrete results can you point to that have materially improved people's lives? Harris stood up suddenly, though she remained in frame. The movement was unexpected, and there was a moment of confusion in the studio. She looked directly at the camera, then back at Daniels. You want concrete results? Let me tell you about concrete results. There are thousands of women alive today because of the work we've done on maternal health, even if the statistics don't reflect it yet. There are communities that have received investment through our programs. There are workers who have better protections because of actions we've taken. But you don't want to talk about any of that because it doesn't fit your narrative. Daniels remained seated, his expression calm but alert. Madame Vice President, I'm not trying to fit anything into a narrative. I'm asking you to provide evidence for the claims you're making. You say thousands of women are alive because of your work on maternal health. Can you cite that study? Can you show us that data? Because if it exists, that would be a powerful answer to my question. But simply asserting it without backing it up doesn't give viewers the information they need. Harris sat back down, but her posture was rigid, defensive. The data is there, Eugene. It's in the reports from the Department of Health and Human Services. It's in the funding allocations we've made. It's in the programs we've expanded. Just because you haven't done your homework doesn't mean the work hasn't happened. That's a serious accusation to make against a journalist, Daniels said, his voice taking on a harder edge. I've reviewed the HHS reports. I've looked at the funding allocations. And what I've found is that while money has been allocated, many of those programs haven't been fully implemented yet. Some haven't even started. So when you say thousands of women are alive because of your work, I'm asking you to show me where that claim comes from, because I haven't seen it in any of the data that's publicly available. Maybe you're not looking in the right places, Harris retorted sharply. Maybe you're so focused on finding failure that you're missing the success that's happening right in front of you. Or maybe, and I think this is more likely, you've decided what story you want to tell before you even walked into this studio, and now you're just going through the motions of an interview to justify the hit piece you've already written in your head. The accusation hung heavy in the air. Daniel's expression shifted, showing a flash of genuine anger for the first time. Madam Vice President, that is completely out of line. I came here to conduct a fair interview with substantive questions. If you can't handle being asked to back up your claims with evidence, that's not a problem with my journalism. That's a problem with your ability to defend your record. And accusing me of planning a hit piece because I won't accept vague assertions as fact is beneath the office you hold. What's beneath this office? Harris fired back, her voice rising again, is being subjected to an interrogation disguised as an interview. You're not here to inform your viewers, Eugene. You're here to create a viral moment where you can claim you held me accountable. Well, congratulations. You've got your moment. I hope it gets you all the clicks and attention you're clearly desperate for. Daniels leaned forward, his voice sharp. This isn't about clicks or attention. This is about doing my job. And my job is to ask people in power tough questions and demand real answers. If that makes me desperate in your eyes, then so be it. But let me ask you something, Madam Vice President. If you can't handle tough questions from a journalist in a controlled studio environment, how are you handling the far more difficult challenges of actually governing? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're more concerned with how you're being perceived than with whether you're actually getting things done. The words seemed to strike a nerve. Harris's eyes flashed with anger, and when she spoke, her voice was low and intense. You have no idea what I deal with every single day. You have no idea the meetings I sit in, the decisions I'm part of, the weight of the responsibility I carry. You get to sit here in your comfortable chair and lob questions at people like me, and then you go home and feel good about yourself for being tough. But you've never had to make the kinds of choices I make. You've never had to balance competing interests and impossible demands. So don't you dare lecture me about getting things done when you've never done anything harder than ask questions for a living. The studio had gone completely silent except for their voices. Daniel's response was measured but firm. You're right, Madam Vice President. I've never held elected office. I've never been Vice President. But I have spent my entire career holding people in power accountable, regardless of party, regardless of position. And what I'm hearing right now is someone who is frustrated that they're being asked to defend their record. That's not my problem. That's yours. And the fact that you're attacking me personally instead of answering the questions tells me everything I need to know about how strong that record actually is. Harris stood up again, and this time she took a step toward Daniels. Her voice was shaking with barely controlled anger. You want to know what my record is? My record is fighting every single day against people who want to see me fail. My record is navigating a political landscape that holds me to standards that nobody else has to meet. My record is being questioned and doubted and second-guessed at every turn, while others get the benefit of the doubt without even having to ask for it. That's my record, Eugene. And if you can't see the fundamental unfairness in that, then you're part of the problem. Madam Vice President, Daniels said, standing up now as well, if you're suggesting that you're being held to different standards, then let's talk about that directly. What specifically are you being held to that others aren't? Give me concrete examples instead of vague allegations about unfairness. Because from my perspective, I would ask these exact same questions of anyone in your position. The fact that you perceive them as unfair doesn't make them unfair. It might just mean you don't like being held accountable. There it is, Harris said, pointing at Daniels. That right there. The assumption that because I'm pushing back, because I'm defending myself, it must mean I have something to hide, or I can't handle accountability. Nobody would say that about someone else. Nobody would frame their legitimate frustration with biased coverage as an inability to handle tough questions. But with me, that's always the conclusion. I must be emotional. I must be defensive. I must be unable to handle the pressure. Do you hear yourself? Do you hear the double standard in your own words? Daniels shook his head. I hear someone who came into this interview expecting softball questions and praise, and when they didn't get it, they decided to attack the interviewer instead of engaging with the substance. You've spent the last several minutes questioning my motives, my integrity, and my journalistic standards, but you still haven't answered the basic question I asked at the beginning of this interview. What has materially changed for American families in the last 6 months? It's a simple question. It deserves a simple answer. Harris stared at Daniels for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with barely contained emotion. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and deliberate. You want a simple answer? Fine. Here's your simple answer. Nothing has changed for American families in the last 6 months that they can point to and say, yes, that made my life easier today. And do you know why? Because the system is broken. Because no matter what we try to do, there are forces working against us at every level. Congress blocks us. The courts block us. Special interests block us. And the media, your media, spends more time criticizing us for not overcoming those obstacles than they do holding the actual obstructionists accountable. Daniels responded immediately. So your answer is that you've accomplished nothing measurable because everyone else is stopping you. Madam Vice President, do you understand how that sounds to voters? Do you understand that people don't want to hear about obstacles? They want to hear about solutions. They want to know that the person they voted for is actually fighting for them, not just fighting against everyone who disagrees with them. I am fighting for them, Harris said, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. Every single day I am fighting for them. But fighting doesn't always mean winning, and I'm not going to lie to the American people and tell them everything is perfect when it's not. I'm not going to give you the polished soundbite you want so you can play it on loop and pretend like we had a real conversation. This is real. This frustration is real. The obstacles are real. And if voters can't handle that truth, then maybe they need to examine what they actually expect from their leaders. That's incredibly condescending, Daniels said sharply. You're essentially telling voters that if they're disappointed with your performance, it's because they don't understand how hard your job is. That's not leadership, Madam Vice President. That's making excuses. And I think voters are smart enough to see the difference. Harris took a step closer, her voice rising to match his intensity. What's condescending is a journalist who pretends to speak for voters while actually just pushing his own agenda. What's condescending is acting like you know what leadership looks like when you've never led anything more complicated than a news segment. You want to talk about voters? Let's talk about how voters are fed a steady diet of negativity and cynicism by people like you, and then you wonder why they're disillusioned with politics. You're part of the cycle that's destroying faith in our institutions, Eugene. You and every other journalist who thinks tearing people down is the same thing as holding them accountable. That's a convenient way to avoid responsibility, Daniels shot back. Blame the media for your failures. Blame the voters for not understanding. Blame everyone except yourself. But here's the reality, Madam Vice President. You took this job knowing what it entailed. You knew you'd be scrutinized. You knew you'd have to deliver results. And when you don't deliver those results, you don't get to play the victim and claim everyone is being unfair to you. That's not how this works. You want to talk about how this works? Harris said, her voice shaking. Let me tell you how this works. I can do everything right, make all the smart decisions, work 20-hour days, and it still won't be enough for people like you. Because the narrative is already set. The story is already written. And that story is that I'm not qualified, I'm not capable, I'm not serious enough to hold this office. So no matter what I accomplish, it gets dismissed. No matter what I fight for, it gets minimized. And when I dare to push back against that treatment, I get accused of being defensive or emotional, or unable to handle pressure. That's how this works, Eugene, and I'm tired of pretending it's anything other than what it is. Daniels held her gaze. If you truly believe that nothing you do will ever be enough, that the narrative is already set against you, then why are you even in this position? Why seek power if you think it's impossible to use it effectively? Because that sounds like resignation, not leadership. And if you've resigned yourself to failure, then what hope do the people who voted for you have that things will ever get better? The question seemed to catch Harris off guard. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For a moment, the anger in her expression gave way to something else, something that looked almost like defeat. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less intense. I haven't resigned myself to anything, but I'm also not going to stand here and accept your framing that acknowledging obstacles is the same as giving up. There's a difference between being realistic about challenges and being defeatist. And the fact that you can't see that difference is exactly why these conversations go nowhere. These conversations go nowhere, Daniels said, his voice sharp. Because you refuse to answer direct questions. I've been trying to get you to provide one specific, measurable accomplishment from the last 6 months, and instead of doing that, you've spent the entire interview attacking me, attacking the media, attacking the voters, and claiming that everyone is conspiring against you. That's not a conversation, Madame Vice President. That's a meltdown. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Harris's eyes widened, and for a moment it looked like she might walk off the set entirely. Instead, she took a deep breath and spoke in a voice that was eerily calm. A meltdown. That's what you're going to call this. A woman standing up for herself, defending her record, and refusing to accept biased framing is having a meltdown. But when a man does the exact same thing, he's being strong, he's being passionate, he's refusing to back down. Do you see it now, Eugene? Do you see exactly what I've been talking about this entire time? This double standard isn't subtle. It's right here in this room, in your words, in your questions, in the way you're looking at me right now. Daniels shook his head firmly. This has nothing to do with gender, and you know it. This has to do with the fact that you came into this interview unprepared to defend your record. And when pressed on it, you chose to make this about everything except the actual substance of your work. You want to talk about double standards? Let's talk about how any other politician would be expected to have answers to these questions. But you're claiming that even asking them is somehow unfair. That's the real double standard here. I had answers, Harris said, her voice rising again. I gave you answers about infrastructure, about manufacturing, about the work we're doing. But you dismissed every single one of them because they didn't fit the narrative you wanted. You wanted me to admit failure. You wanted me to say we've accomplished nothing. And when I wouldn't give you that, you just kept pushing and pushing until you could provoke the exact reaction you were looking for. Well, congratulations, Eugene. You got it. I hope it was worth it. What I wanted, Daniels said firmly, was the truth, and what I got was evasion, deflection, and personal attacks. If that's what you consider answering questions, then I think the American people deserve better from their vice president. Harris stared at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was cold and final. What the American people deserve is a media that actually cares about informing them instead of entertaining them. What they deserve is journalists who understand the difference between accountability and ambush. And what they deserve is better than this interview, better than you, and better than the gotcha politics you represent. We're done here. She reached up and removed her microphone, the sound of it hitting the table audible in the silence. Daniels remained standing, watching as she walked toward the edge of the set. Madame Vice President, he called after her. Walking away from tough questions doesn't make them go away. At some point, you're going to have to answer them. Harris paused at the edge of the set, turning back to look at him one final time. I've been answering tough questions my entire career, Eugene. The difference is I used to believe that answering them mattered, that if I just explained things clearly enough, worked hard enough, proved myself enough, eventually it would be enough. But interviews like this one have taught me something important. For some people, nothing will ever be enough. And I'm done trying to satisfy people who were never asking questions in good faith to begin with." With that, she turned and walked off the set, leaving Daniels standing alone in the studio. The camera continued rolling, capturing his expression as he processed what had just happened. He looked directly into the camera and spoke to the viewers. "You just witnessed Vice President Kamala Harris walk out of an interview after being asked to defend her administration's record. Make of that what you will." So there you have it. One of the most explosive political interviews in recent memory. An exchange that started with standard policy questions and ended with the vice president walking off the set. What do you think about how this interview unfolded? Was Daniels out of line with his questioning, or was Harris unable to handle legitimate scrutiny? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our coverage of the fallout from this incredible moment. What do you think the consequences of this interview will be for Harris's political future?